My name is Mark, and I worked at a funeral home in Boston. What I'm about to share isn't a story I heard or invented. It's something I experienced firsthand, and it still haunts me every night. During the years I spent working on embalming and preparing bodies for wakes, I encountered strange things, felt presences, heard noises that had no explanation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that morning. That evening, they brought in the body of a woman about 50 years old. Her name was Rose Ellen. According to the medical report, she had died of a sudden heart attack at home. The paperwork was handled by her husband, a quiet man with a lost look in his eyes, barely saying a word, just nodding whenever we explained the procedures. He said his wife had never had heart problems and that everything happened much too quickly. I didn't pry further. Often families just don't want to talk about it. I proceeded with my job. The body looked fine, no signs of violence or anything unusual. Still, the instant I touched her skin, I sensed something odd. It wasn't as cold as the other bodies I'd worked with before, nor was it warm exactly, but it lacked that deep chill of death. I told myself it was likely because she hadn't been gone long, or because Boston's climate can sometimes slow the cooling process. I repeated this to myself over and over to keep from panicking. I carried out the usual steps, washing her, dressing her in the clothes her husband provided, styling her hair. While doing this, an unpleasant feeling gnawed at me, as though someone were watching me from behind. I'd glance over my shoulder occasionally, only to confirm no one else was in the room. I tried my best to ignore it and continue. After finishing, I placed her in the coffin, sealing it only lightly so that the family could see her face during the wake. The relatives arrived, remaining in the viewing room for several hours. It was a small wake, no more than 10 people. Nobody prayed out, loud or sobbed uncontrollably. There was just a low murmur of conversation, as if they wanted the night to pass quickly. Close to midnight, most of them began to leave until only her husband and one of her sisters stayed. I was in the office going over some papers when I overheard the sister murmuring something. Intrigued, I walked over discreetly and heard her, telling the husband, "I told you this wasn't right. We never should have brought her here." I didn't understand what she meant, but the look in that man's eyes was pure fear, contained, as though he didn't want to verbalize what he was really thinking. Soon they left the funeral home, leaving me alone. I did a quick check of everything before heading to the small employee room to rest. It was late, and we had a space to lie down during night shifts. On my way, I passed through the viewing room. The dim light elongated the shadows on the walls. I approached the coffin again, and that uneasy warmth seemed to cling to the air. Something felt wrong. I hurried out and lay down, forcing myself to try to sleep, but I kept picturing the body that had never grown completely cold. I was trying to block it all out when I heard a loud noise, like something heavy had fallen. I shot upright, heart hammering. The sound had come from the viewing room. With my pulse racing, I walked over, bracing for who knew what. When I entered, I froze. The coffin lid was on the floor. To this day, I can't recall if I screamed. I only remember how my lungs seemed to seize up, refusing to draw breath. I inched closer, trembling, and saw something chilling. The woman's lips were moving, not in a random reflex, but a steady opening and closing, as if trying to form words. I staggered back, trembling uncontrollably, yet I couldn't look away. Her eyes were still closed, but her mouth kept opening and shutting in an eerie rhythm. Then I noticed something else. She was drawing in a faint breath. My mind spun. I tried to think of some explanation, but there was none. If she was alive, if the doctors had made a mistake, how could she have shown no vital signs for so long? Why hadn't her family noticed? Worse, why was her skin still a bit warm? Suddenly, her head tilted slightly in my direction, not as a random muscle spasm, but as if trying to look at me. That's when I noticed her skin had a slight sheen, like a thin layer of sweat. Rigor mortis had not set in. A guttural sound rose from her throat, a choked noise, like a cry she couldn't quite vocalize. In that moment, the overhead light flickered, and I felt a burst of cold air swirling around me. The coffin lid on the floor seemed to shift on its own. I ran, without looking back. Breath ragged, sweat cold on my forehead. I refused to go near that room again. Instead, I holed up in the office, hands shaking, mind in chaos. I wanted to call the paramedics, but what would I say? That a corpse was moving. No one would believe me, so I just waited for dawn, in shock. At 6 in the morning, the day shift employees arrived. The first person I saw was my co-worker, John, a man who'd been there for years. I pulled him aside and blurted out part of what I'd witnessed. His expression was serious, not surprised. He spoke quietly. Sometimes it happens. Some bodies shouldn't be here. I didn't ask what he meant. I only gathered my things and walked out. I quit the next day. I never found out what happened to Rose. I worked for years in a cemetery in Chicago. It wasn't an easy job, but over time you get used to the company of the dead. The routine becomes mechanical, digging, burying, cleaning. Yet, there are always days that feel different, days that remain etched in your memory, days that make you question what's real. I remember one afternoon clearly. The sun was hiding behind the clouds, and the wind carried an uncommon chill. A funeral had just ended, and the visitors were leaving little by little. I stayed back, as I often did, to ensure everything was in order. That's when I saw him, a man sitting on a nearby bench, hands resting on his knees, staring at a freshly covered grave. At first, it seemed normal, someone grieving, but then I realized he was the same man we had just buried that day. My heart skipped a beat. I saw him as clearly as I see my own hands. I swallowed hard and glanced at my co-worker, hoping to confirm. I wasn't imagining things, but when I looked back at the bench, it was empty. I stood frozen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone who looked like him. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but there was something about his expression, something about his eyes. It gave me the sense that he knew he was dead. That night, when the cemetery fell silent, I decided to stay longer. It wasn't the first time I had sensed something strange in that place, but it was the first time I had seen something with such clarity. I walked among the tombstones, looking at the candles some families had left behind, flickering faintly in the wind. There was a distinct feeling in the air, as though I wasn't alone. I approached the grave we had just closed. The dirt was still fresh and damp from the recent digging. I don't know why, but I stood there just waiting, letting time stretch out. The wind hissed through the headstones, making the tree branches creak. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Not an ordinary noise, not the wind or some insect. It was a low, mournful murmur that seemed to come from beneath the ground. I stopped breathing, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me again. I bent over, trying to catch the sound more clearly. Then I heard a faint voice, fragile but unmistakably real, rising from the earth. Where am I? I lurched backward, my heart hammering in my ears. Nobody could be down there, no one alive. I stood paralyzed, waiting to see if it would repeat, but only the wind answered. Finally, I rushed back to the small tool shed where we kept our shovels and supplies, locking myself inside for a while, trying to steady my nerves. It couldn't be possible. It just couldn't. I checked my watch. Midnight was near. I peered out the shed window at the cemetery. That's when I saw him again, the same man, standing right by his own grave, his head bowed as if he were listening for something. My first instinct was to run, to get as far away as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt compelled to stay and watch him. I turned on my flashlight, but its beam didn't illuminate him the way it should have. It was as though his figure absorbed the light. He was both there and not there. "What do you want?" I whispered, not even realizing I had spoken aloud. He didn't answer, but I saw his head slowly turn toward me. His eyes had no glimmer of life in them, only a profound sadness, a void that chilled me to the bone. Then his lips moved. No words emerged, no sound, but somehow I understood what he was saying. "I don't know where I am." I remained motionless, realizing he did not know he was dead, or refused to accept it. My stomach twisted. If no one helped him, perhaps he would. Remain there forever, wandering. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking, but some instinct pushed me to take a step forward, although I had no idea what I was doing or why. Summoning courage, I swallowed hard and said, You don't belong here anymore." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought he would come closer, maybe move toward me, but then I saw the sorrow in his gaze deepen. He stepped back. The moonlight seemed to fade, and a heaviness pressed on the air, as if the entire cemetery was holding its breath. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, he vanished. The wind carried off the last echo of his presence, leaving me alone, chilled to the core. I stood there, my bones aching with cold, unsure if I had somehow helped release him, or if he had simply disappeared for a while. Something in me sensed I wouldn't see him again. After that night, the cemetery felt different. No more whispers in the darkness, no silhouettes lurking on benches. Still, sometimes, when I passed by his tomb, I paused and listened, because I knew some of the dead remained trapped, and I didn't want to witness yet another soul unable to find its way. Now every time I bury someone, I can't help but glance around the benches into the shadows, half expecting to see someone else who shouldn't be there. Because I've learned that some of the dead do not leave us. They wander, trying to understand what happened. Sometimes they manage. The days went by, but that man's image stayed with me. His lost expression, his stare caught between this world and the next. Whenever I strolled through the graves, I felt pulled toward his tomb, like something was calling me over. I didn't talk about what I had seen to anyone, not wanting them to think I was crazy. But each night, when darkness fell over those headstones, I sensed I was not alone. Work at the cemetery never really stops. There's a burial nearly every day, but every time a new one comes in, a weight returns to my chest. How many will linger like that man, oblivious to the fact that they no longer belong among the living? I tried ignoring that unease, but one night something happened that showed me this was far from over. In the early hours, a dull thud woke me in the tool shed, as if something had dropped heavily onto the ground. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked out. An icy wind was sweeping through the tombs. I searched for the source of the noise, and that's when I saw him again, standing by his own grave, head down as if listening. Initially I wanted to run, but once more I found my feet rooted to the ground, as though some invisible force kept me there, forcing me to look. I turned on the flashlight again, but the same thing happened. He absorbed the light as if it couldn't touch him. My breath caught in my throat, but a quiet question escaped my lips. "What do you want?" No answer, but I watched as his head turned slowly toward me again. This time, his eyes were darker, emptier, and even deeper sorrow swirling within them. Then, in silence, I saw him mouth words I couldn't actually hear, though I grasped their meaning. "I don't know where I am." My heart pounded. He didn't realize he was dead, or else he refused to see it. I felt a wave of terror, but also pity. I tried to say something, anything, but the words stayed lodged in my throat. Then I managed a trembling whisper. You're no longer supposed to be here." His gaze fell on me. For a long moment I thought he might come closer, might cross the distance between us. But then I noticed a shift, as though the entire cemetery held its breath. The sadness in his stare seemed to intensify. He took one step backward. The light of the moon flickered, and I felt a suffocating pressure, like the world itself had gone still. Then, in an instant, he was gone. The wind carried away the last vestige of his presence, leaving me standing there, numb with cold and confusion. I don't know if I set him free, or if he simply vanished for a time, but a part of me sensed that was the final time I would see him. From that day on, the cemetery felt changed. No whispers, no figure on the bench. Still, whenever I pass his grave, I pause briefly and listen, because I'm sure some of the dead stay trapped, and I don't wish to be a witness again to someone else unable to find their path. Now each time I bury someone, I wonder if it will be the last time I see them, or if they'll appear again, gazing at me from the darkness of their own grave. It's not common to attend a funeral at midnight. Farewells usually take place in daylight, under the sun. Pale and distant though it may be, there's some solace it can offer that night cannot. Yet, the funeral of Matthew Rogers happened at the darkest hour, at his mother's insistence. She was a deeply superstitious woman who believed that evil spirits took possession of the souls of those buried by daylight. Matthew had died under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly how it happened, only that he was found lifeless in his house, on his bedroom floor, his eyes open, his face frozen in terror. News spread quickly through the small town of Ravenswood, where everyone knew each other and rumors raced like fire through dry grass. The whispers of his death were as dark as the night itself. Some said it was a massive heart attack. Others muttered of curses or supernatural forces that had claimed his life. I decided to attend the funeral out of respect for his family. We weren't close friends, but Matthew and I had spent a few afternoons in the local bar, chatting idly about trivial matters. I couldn't fathom what his family was going through, especially his mother, Mrs. Rogers, a woman who had already suffered the loss of her husband years before. I thought my presence might offer her some small comfort, though deep down I knew it wouldn't fill the chasm left by her son's death. The Church of St. Joseph stood at the center of town, an old stone structure that had weathered the centuries. That night, thick clouds covered the sky, leaving not a single star visible. I walked the empty streets toward the church, the cold night air cutting straight to my bones. Traffic was non-existent, only the echo of my footsteps breaking the silence. As I arrived, I noticed the church was dimly lit by candles placed along the pews, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, giving the place a nearly supernatural atmosphere. The few people there sat in silence, heads bowed, as if the weight of night and tragedy was too much to bear. I took a seat in the last row, wanting to witness the ceremony without drawing attention to myself. Matthew's coffin was up front, open for a final goodbye. His body lay inside, dressed in a black suit, hands crossed on his chest. His face was pale and expressionless, showing no trace of the horror he must have felt at the moment of death. It made me wonder if the mortician had deliberately softened his features, or if the true terror was locked away in some hidden corner of that dark night. The priest, an older man with grey hair and a deep voice, began the ceremony with a prayer. As he spoke, the church's atmosphere seemed to tighten, as if some invisible force was pressing down on us. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't rid myself of the sense that something was wrong. The way the candlelight flickered, the utter silence of the attendees, the presence of Matthew's lifeless body. It all filled me with an inexplicable unease. Then it happened. In the middle of the prayer, the lights went out without warning, plunging the church into absolute darkness. It was so dense that I couldn't see my own hands. A murmur of confusion and fear rose among the mourners. But no, one dared move. I could practically hear my heart thudding in my ears as I struggled to maintain composure. The darkness was total, oppressive, as if the air itself had been devoured by some malignant force that wrapped itself around us. The silence lasted what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few seconds. A cold chill raced down. My spine, the kind of chill that isn't merely physical but something deeper, something a coat can't banish. That was when I sensed a presence, an unmistakable certainty that someone or something was in the church that had no business being. There, suddenly, the lights flickered back on, first unsteadily, then with a force that nearly blinded us after the all-consuming blackness. The first thing I did was look at the coffin, and what I saw made me gasp. Matthew was no longer in the same position. He'd been in just minutes before. His head, which had been facing the ceiling, was now slightly turned to the left, and his hands, once crossed on his chest, were lowered at his sides. It was a small change, but enough for my mind to register that something was very wrong. I never returned to that church. Not that night, not ever. Word of the incident spread quickly, and soon St. Luke became the center of countless rumors and theories about what really took place. Some said Matthew's spirit was trapped, unable to rest in peace, and that this midnight funeral had unleashed forces that should never have been disturbed. Others whispered of a curse, a divine punishment for an unconfessed sin. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that the darkness I experienced in that church wasn't normal. It was alive, a malignant presence that seized everything in its reach and manifested through Matthew's corpse in a way that logic cannot explain. Sometimes on the stillest nights I close my eyes and see his pale face, eyes wide, staring at something the living shouldn't see. The people of St. Luke tried to forget. They moved on, buried the past, and turned the midnight funeral into nothing more than a ghost story for outsiders. But for those of us who were there, there's no erasing it. We'll carry that image in our minds forever. The chill still stalks me, reminding me that there are forces in this world we can't and shouldn't try to understand. Though I attempt to move on, a part of me will always wonder what truly happened that night. What did we awaken with in that midnight funeral? And I'm afraid that the answer is something I'd rather never discover. There was something unsettling about the way the wind howled through the dry leaves that morning. Thick, grey clouds loomed over Silver Creek, a small mountain town, casting an eerie gloom as if a heavy blanket had been draped over the entire place. The air felt thick, suffocating in its silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had never been particularly superstitious, but after Luke Harris died, something changed. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching, and an unshakable sense of unease crept through every street and alleyway. His death had already shaken the town, but it was during his funeral that the real nightmare began. Luke Harris had always been one of those people destined for something great. He had a magnetic presence, an effortless charm, and a smile that could break through the hardest exterior. His sudden and unexpected death felt like a cruel joke. A freak car accident had taken him in an instant, leaving behind only shock and unanswered questions. The news spread like wildfire, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief took hold of Silver Creek. On the day of his funeral, St. Michael's Church was packed beyond capacity. The wooden pews were filled, and those who couldn't find a seat stood pressed against the cold stone walls. Candles flickered in the dim interior, the scent of burning wax mixing with the heavy aroma of flowers adorning the altar. Father Raymond spoke in a solemn, measured tone, his words met with hushed reverence. But beneath the respectful silence, something else lurked, an invisible tension thick enough to suffocate. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It started subtly, a barely perceptible anomaly. Each time Father Raymond mentioned Luke's name, I heard something strange, a faint echo, barely more than a whisper, reverberating through the high stone walls. At first I dismissed it as a trick of the acoustics, but each repetition of his name made the echo grow stronger, more distinct. It stopped sounding like a natural reflection of sound and became something else, a low, drawn-out murmur that seemed to seep from the very cracks in the church walls, as though the stone itself was speaking. I glanced around, searching for confirmation that others had noticed. Some faces were drawn tight with tension, but no one spoke. No one reacted. Maybe they heard it, but chose not to acknowledge it. Maybe they were too afraid. The echo didn't stop. It pulsed through the church like a heartbeat, growing stronger with each utterance of Luke's name. It wasn't random anymore. It followed a pattern, an unnatural rhythm weaving itself into the funeral proceedings. The effect was deeply unsettling, making my skin prickle with cold sweat. My gaze kept returning to the coffin at the front, draped in cloth and covered in white lilies. Inside lay Luke, a young man whose future had been stolen too soon. And yet it felt like he wasn't gone, not completely. Every time his name was spoken, that unnatural echo crawled along the church walls, a disembodied lament that refused to be ignored. When the service ended, the congregation rose in near silence, making their way toward the cemetery. And as the church emptied, the echo faded. The absence of sound should have been comforting, but it left behind an eerie void, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. St. Michael's Cemetery rested on the outskirts of town, nestled on a hill surrounded by towering cypress trees that stood like ancient sentinels. As we walked, the sky darkened even further, thick with the promise of rain. A heavy weight pressed on my chest, an instinctual warning that whatever had started in the church wasn't over. The grave diggers lowered the coffin, and the crowd gathered in uneasy silence. No one spoke. The first shovelful of dirt struck. The coffin lid, and the echo returned, But this time it wasn't a distant whisper. It was louder, sharper, as though the earth itself was calling Luke's name from below. A ripple of fear spread through the mourners. Hushed gasps and frantic glances exchanged as the sound continued, relentless and unnatural. Luke's mother, Margaret, collapsed into sobs, and the expression on her face mirrored the terror rising in my own chest. How could this be real? I don't know how long we stood there, frozen by that sound. It felt endless, as though time itself had fractured. Eventually, Father Raymond urged the crowd to leave, gently suggesting the family needed space. People moved in small groups, whispering in hushed voices, their faces pale with confusion and fear. But the echo, it stayed with me, burrowing into my mind like a song I couldn't unhear. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The echo in the church, the sound of dirt hitting the coffin, the unnatural whisper woven into the wind. I wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, others started murmuring about strange occurrences, faint echoes in the dead of night, ghostly murmurs drifting from the church walls, whispers of Luke's name carried by the wind. Some townsfolk began avoiding the cemetery entirely, claiming a curse had settled over it. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Luke's spirit was trapped, unable to find peace. Others insisted it was something darker, a punishment, a warning. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that the unease wouldn't leave me. Every time someone mentioned Luke, I felt the echo stir inside me, a vibration of dread that refused to fade. My anxiety spiraled, sleep became a luxury, my appetite disappeared. Even hearing his name in casual conversation sent an icy shiver down my spine. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I had to know the truth. I couldn't keep living in fear of something unseen, something I didn't understand. One night, under a heavy sky devoid of stars, I made my way to the church alone. It was locked, but I knew of a side entrance the caretakers sometimes left unlatched. Slipping inside, I was greeted by darkness, broken only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through stained glass windows. My footsteps echoed through the vast emptiness as I moved down the central aisle, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence felt watchful. The very walls seemed to breathe. And then I heard it. Soft at first, like a whisper lost in the wind. But then it grew, unfolding like a wave. The echo was waiting for me. It called Luke's name over and over, weaving through the rafters, a disembodied voice thick with longing. But this time, there was something else mixed in. A second voice, fragmented and desperate. I couldn't understand all of it, but the words that reached me were unmistakable. Cries for help, pleas of regret, the lingering echoes of someone not ready to leave. It was Luke, a piece of him trapped, caught in an endless loop, his voice replaying over and over, unheard, unanswered. The realization sent a cold shock through me, tears stinging my eyes. I stood there frozen as the echoes swirled around me, a chorus of sorrow and unfinished goodbyes. I didn't know how to help. I didn't know if I even could. But in that moment, I did the only thing that felt right. I spoke to him. I told him he was gone, that it was time to rest. My voice trembled in the darkness, a fragile sound against the weight of something vast and ancient. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the echo began to fade. Each repetition grew softer, weaker, until at last silence settled over the church once more. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, not waiting, but at peace. Days passed. The whispers stopped. The cemetery grew quiet. Silver Creek returned to its routines, but sometimes, late at night, I still remember the echo. Luke's name vibrating with fear and longing, a testament to the unfinished stories the dead sometimes leave behind. It was Luke, a piece of him trapped, caught in an endless loop, his voice replaying over and over, unheard, unanswered. The realization sent a cold shock through me, tears stinging my eyes. I stood there frozen as the echoes swirled around me, a chorus of sorrow and unfinished goodbyes. I didn't know how to help. I didn't know if I even could. But in that moment, I did the only thing that felt right. I spoke to him. I told him he was gone, that it was time to rest. My voice trembled in the darkness, a fragile sound against the weight of something vast and ancient. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the echo began to fade. Each repetition grew softer, weaker, until at last silence settled over the church once more. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, not waiting, but at peace. Days passed. The whispers stopped. The cemetery grew quiet. Silver Creek returned to its routines, but sometimes, late at night, I still remember the echo. Luke's name vibrating with fear and longing, a testament to the unfinished stories the dead sometimes leave behind. I never thought I'd step foot in Blackwood Cemetery again. At least, not so soon, and certainly not under these circumstances. It was the kind of place you avoid until life's inevitable tragedies drag you there. But the news of Robert's death caught me off guard. Not just because I hadn't seen him in years, but because the suddenness of it shook something deep inside me, an old fear I hadn't felt in a long time. When the call came, a familiar chill crawled down my spine, the kind of dread that is both fear and something darker, anchored in memory. Robert, George, Daniel, and I had been inseparable growing up, all from the same neighborhood. We shared adventures, pranks, and fears, and one place we often visited, equal parts thrilled and terrified, was Blackwood Cemetery, drawn by the local legend of the phantom gravedigger. The tale went that he had died tragically years ago, and now his spirit prowled the grounds, searching for souls that couldn't rest, dragging them away forever. Being kids, we wove those stories into our games, though they were always tinged with real terror. We dared each other to sneak in after sundown, each challenge more reckless than the last. None of us ever imagined we'd be facing those childhood nightmares again, only this time it was real. Robert's funeral was a bleak, heavy day, draped over Blackwood Cemetery like a suffocating shroud. The sky was overcast, as if even nature was in mourning. The three of us who remained, George, Daniel, and I, stood there, feeling the absence of our fourth friend like a physical weight. We hadn't seen much of each other in recent years. Life had pulled us in different directions. But Robert's death had brought us back to this place, where so many old memories slept. Rumors said it was a car accident, one of those sudden events that tear someone away unexpectedly. Yet part of me refused to accept that there wasn't something more to it. As the funeral ended and Robert's casket was lowered into the ground, a wave of memories resurfaced. Memories of the nights we would sneak in among these headstones, each of us secretly terrified of the phantom gravedigger. Our dares, the stories we told each other by moonlight, everything came flooding back. George was especially tense, glancing uneasily between the tombstones. Daniel was silent, head bowed, lost in his own thoughts. But the moment the casket reached the bottom, George went stiff, his eyes widening in alarm. He muttered something under his breath, and before we could react, he started walking away from us, deeper into the cemetery. Daniel and I both called his name, but George acted as if he couldn't hear us. He marched forward, drawn by some invisible force. Alarmed, I ran after him, a sense of dread blooming in my chest. Could George have seen something among the graves? Something from our childhood nightmares awakened in the midst of our grief. He finally stopped in front of a specific headstone and dropped to his knees, muttering in a trembling voice. When I caught up, I recognized the grave marker instantly. It was the one we had always associated with the phantom gravedigger. A cold terror gripped me. George wore a look of sheer horror, his eyes blank, as if he had witnessed something beyond reason. He murmured over and over that he had seen it. That the phantom gravedigger was there, coming for us. I tried to calm him, but he was shaking violently, sweat pouring down his face. Without warning, he toppled over, his body limp as if drained of all energy. I crouched beside him, my heart racing, struggling to lift him. His eyes were open yet vacant, like his soul had fled. And then I felt something behind me, an oppressive presence, cold and malevolent. A wave of terror hit me, and every instinct screamed for me to run. Hoisting George, I forced myself to move, half carrying him, back toward the cemetery's main path, where Daniel was waiting, equally scared and at a loss. We managed to get past the gates, and only once we were outside did I feel like I could breathe again. Daniel dialed for an ambulance, and George was rushed to the hospital. But I couldn't forget that presence, the overwhelming certainty that something in Blackwood Cemetery had reached out for George, draining part of him. The doctors could only say that George had suffered a mental breakdown. No medical test explained his hollow stare or his whispered ravings about the gravedigger whenever he drifted into delirium. Daniel and I tried moving on, convincing ourselves it was all trauma and suggestion, but in my heart I knew better. Each night I lay awake, the old legends creeping back, the dares by moonlight, and that crippling certainty that the phantom gravedigger was no mere child's tale. It was something real, ancient, and voracious. A few months passed before I got a call. George had disappeared from the hospital, leaving no note or trace. Immediately, I thought of the cemetery. I rushed there, my heart in my throat, but I found only the same silent rows of tombstones. Yet the sensation of that presence lingered, heavier than before, as though it was satisfied after claiming what it considered rightfully its. I can't prove anything, but I've come to believe the phantom gravedigger's shadow follows me too. On nights when the wind blows a certain way, I feel a chill crawl along my spine, a reminder that his presence might be close, closing in. He has already taken George, maybe Robert too, and now, perhaps, he is waiting patiently for Daniel and me. There's no place to hide from a legend that turns out to be real. I try to go on with my life, but I can never shake the feeling that I'm next, that the phantom's dark silhouette is watching from some corner of the world, waiting for me to let my guard down. And when that moment comes, I'll hear the scrape of a shovel on dirt, followed by footsteps in the silent paths of Blackwood Cemetery. The final echo of a fate we once laughed off as kids. We were wrong. Some horrors never rest, and we can only wait until the day they come calling for us too. I wasn't expecting to get a phone call that night, especially not from someone I barely knew, just enough to recognize by sight. Yet when my phone rang and I saw the name Samuel Myers on the screen, a man I hadn't seen in years, I felt a jolt of unease. I answered, thinking maybe he had dialed me by mistake, But the other end of the line was silent, a deep, frigid silence that seemed to reach through the phone and brush against something dark inside me. It was only later, after calling my mother, that I found out Samuel had died the previous day. An accident, she told me, one of those freak incidents that snatch life away in an instant. They found him in his car, crashed into a tree along the old highway leading out of town. She mentioned the wake would be held that evening at his parents' house. Even though I barely knew him, something in her tone, and in my own gut, insisted I should go. I had a hunch, an unsettling feeling that I needed to be there. I arrived at the Myers home at dusk. The atmosphere was unbearably heavy, as if the air itself was saturated with sorrow. It was an old wooden house, showing its age, and only a few floor lamps and candles provided illumination, giving the place a more somber look than usual. Family and acquaintances had gathered in the living room, forming a loose circle around the open casket. Everyone was silent, that suffocating hush that grips mourners when the loss is too sudden to process. I tried to do the polite thing, offering a few words of condolence, although I doubted it could bring genuine comfort. Samuel's mother looked utterly lost, her eyes vacant. His father, once a strong and resolute figure, seemed withered somehow, gaze haunted and hollow. I glanced at the coffin, where Samuel lay with a surprisingly tranquil expression. Then I stepped aside, not wanting to linger too close to the body, and settled in a chair along the wall. My thoughts kept drifting to the call I'd received earlier that night. How there hadn't been any sound at all, not even static, as if the line were dead. Minutes passed in near silence, with only a few muted sobs or hushed conversations. Suddenly, a phone began to ring, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet. Normally I would have ignored it. Someone must have forgotten to silence their phone, but I caught sight of the others' reactions. Everyone was staring at the same corner of the room, where a small table stood. The phone ringing on it was Samuel's. A chill ran down my spine. I recognized that old, somewhat battered phone. I'd seen him carrying it around downtown before. But he was in the coffin now, wasn't he? Yet here was his phone, ringing. No one else budged. Finally, one of Samuel's cousins, looking hesitant and pale, approached and answered. Instantly a look of sheer horror flooded his face. He tried to speak, but only managed a choking sound before dropping the phone like it had burned him. He stumbled back, eyes wild, and a few bystanders hurried over to steady him. The call ended abruptly. Nobody moved for a moment. We were trapped in collective shock, an echo of dread reverberating in the room. Then the phone started ringing again, as if demanding someone else pick it up. People exchanged nervous looks, and eventually Samuel's father, his hands trembling, reached over to answer. I couldn't hear if there was a voice on the other end, but I watched the color drain from his face. His eyes glazed over as though he'd witnessed something unspeakable. He hung up without a word and left the room. After that, the phone kept ringing. One by one, different relatives and friends answered it, never for long. They'd pick up, freeze in terror, and drop the receiver. Some let out muffled cries, others simply went silent. Whispers and small bursts of panic spread among the mourners, and a sense of suffocating fear took over. It made no sense. What could be on the other end of that line? I glanced at my own phone, heart pounding at the idea it might ring at any moment. Amid all this, one of the older women sitting close to the casket suddenly shrieked, so loudly that everyone jumped. She clutched her own cell phone, face twisted in unmasked horror. She flung it away, and I heard a faint, impossible moan coming through the speaker, something not quite human. That sound echoed in my head like a nightmare I'd never escape. A wave of panic flooded the room. Some tried to leave the house, but the doors were stuck, jammed, as though an unseen force refused to let them open. People broke down in tears or chanted rushed prayers under their breath, trembling violently. I found myself paralyzed, unsure whether to run for an exit or try to help. My mind spun. This couldn't be real. Phones don't just ring with voices from beyond. But the evidence played out in front of me, impossible to deny. Eventually, the calls began to dwindle, and an unnatural hush settled over the house. I couldn't tell which was worse, the ringing phones or this tense silence loaded with fear. Then out of nowhere, another phone rang, bringing that tension back up to a breaking point. Someone answered and reacted the same way, eyes widening, breath caught, face drained of color. No one knew what to do or where to go. Even stepping outside seemed impossible. Yet after a stretch of time that felt endless, the calls stopped altogether. In that dreadful calm, I thought I heard a faint whisper drifting through the room, a voice so low it was barely audible. It was sinister, a tone that didn't sound human, or at least not fully of this world. I couldn't distinguish words, only a malevolence that made my hair stand on end. Those who were still in the house looked around, terrified, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing to see. Shortly after, as though some barrier had been lifted, the doors opened easily again. People fled in every direction. I saw tears, shaking limbs, eyes huge with panic. I stayed put for a moment, compelled by a feeling of dread fascination. Something had just manifested here, something that used Samuel's phone, and maybe even others, to reach us. At last, my fear got the better of me, and I made my way toward the exit. I passed Samuel's phone, resting quietly on the small table. Its screen glowed faintly. Unable to resist, I peeked at the call log. My stomach twisted when I saw that the last number it had dialed was mine. A chill shot up my spine. I ran out without hesitation, nearly tripping over the threshold. I drove around for hours, too shaken to head straight home. My mind wouldn't settle. The images, the screams, that ghostly moan on the other end of the line. The knowledge that I, too, had received a call from a dead man's phone. I changed my phone number soon after that. For weeks, I refused to answer any call if I didn't recognize the number. But the nightmares came anyway. Every night I dreamed. The phone was ringing, an endless tone that I couldn't shut off. In those dreams, I'd pick up, only to hear that same inhuman sound, drawing closer each time, until I woke up, drenched in sweat. Others in town whispered of similar events. Mysterious calls, nightmares, whispered voices on lines gone dead. Rumors spread that it was Samuel's spirit, or something else, taking advantage of his death to cross into our world. I had no clue which was right. I only knew I would never truly feel safe again. Because deep in my bones, I suspected that wasn't Samuel calling. Whatever it was far worse. And whenever the phone rings, even now, an irrational terror grips me. Because once a phone is connected to the beyond, it never really stops ringing. And the calls, they are never for the living. I had never seen that family before. In a small town like Fairhaven, where everyone knows everyone, any unfamiliar face stands out, especially at a funeral. The deceased was an older man named Hubert Miles, someone I had only seen a handful of times. He lived on the outskirts near the woods, kept mostly to himself, and nobody in town knew him well. That's why the sudden appearance of this strange family, adamant about performing some bizarre ritual during his funeral, was so unsettling. His body had been found under unusual circumstances. Neighbors had alerted the authorities when a foul smell began emanating from his isolated home. By the time they went inside, he was already in an advanced state of decomposition. His death didn't cause much of a stir, as few people had been close to him. Most remembered him as a solitary figure who avoided interaction, whose house remained perpetually shrouded in an aura of secrecy. When they announced the funeral, I didn't expect many to attend. However, curiosity alone drew a surprising number of townsfolk to the small stone church of Fairhaven. That's where I first saw them. 5 people, all with pale skin and dark hair. The father and mother appeared to be in their 40s, and there were 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. Their sharp facial features and sunken eyes gave them an almost spectral appearance. None of us in town had seen them before, but the intensity of their stares made people keep their distance. It was as though the air around them was charged with something unnatural. The funeral began normally enough. The old priest, his voice weary with age, led the usual prayers. Incense mixed with the smell of the candles, the wooden pews creaking under the weight of the attendees. People watched quietly, expecting the ceremony to be brief and uneventful. Yet things soon took a turn. At the end of the sermon, the father of this unknown family stepped forward and whispered something to the priest. I couldn't catch the words, but I saw the priest's confused expression as he hesitated before stepping aside. The stranger took his place beside the coffin and began speaking in a language none of us recognized. The words had a rhythmic, lilting quality, hypnotic yet unsettling, sending a chill through my bones. The mother and children joined in, forming a circle around Hubert's coffin. Their voices rose and fell in unison, growing faster and more urgent with each passing second, as though summoning something unseen. The candles lining the church aisles flickered violently, their light casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Then the very atmosphere in the church shifted. A suffocating heaviness settled over us, as if the air had suddenly thickened. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I noticed people around me exchanging nervous glances. Some looked faint, as though they might pass out at any moment. I tried to convince myself it was just the power of suggestion, that we had all been spooked by the eerie chanting, but my heart pounded in my chest, refusing to heed logic. Suddenly, I had the sensation that the room was spinning, that the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw fleeting shapes, twisted silhouettes, mocking faces. My stomach twisted in panic. The sea. Chanting grew even louder, nearly drowning out my own frantic thoughts. People began to react. I heard a woman stifling a sob, an older man dropping to his knees, muttering nonsense words, or perhaps a language none of us knew. Another person collapsed. Someone else cried for help, though no one knew how to respond. It was as if an invisible force had seized control of that sacred space, bending it to its will. Then in an instant, the candle flames snuffed out, plunging us into utter darkness. The chanting reached a crescendo, echoing in my ears alongside a strange hum, more felt than heard, a vibration deep in the ground beneath us. The darkness was oppressive, alive, pressing down on my chest. For a moment, I thought I might forget how to breathe. My vision was useless, so I shut my eyes, gripping the pew in front of me. Without warning, the chanting stopped, cut off, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. In that pitch-black void, I sensed movement, a near silent shifting like cloth sliding over wood. My mind conjured monstrous shapes prowling the aisles, but I dared not open my eyes. Suddenly, the candle flames reignited all at once. The church was no longer entirely dark, though the light was weak and flickering. The family stood around the coffin, arms stretched forward, palms down over the lid. And that's when I noticed something had changed. Hubert's body was no longer in the position I had seen moments before. Instead of lying flat in the coffin, it was now sitting upright. His eyes remained closed, but his posture had shifted completely. His skin, which had been pale and lifeless, now bore a faint sheen, as if damp with sweat or something else. A wave of pure dread crashed over me. Around me, others let out gasps and startled cries. A woman fainted. A man began whispering a desperate prayer. But the family remained eerily calm, almost triumphant, as if they had achieved exactly what they intended. Then, very deliberately, the mother stepped forward and closed the coffin, pressing the lid down with a firm push. The sound of it shutting echoed through the stillness like a thunderclap. The chanting stopped altogether, leaving behind an eerie silence. We remained frozen, paralyzed by the impossibility of what we had just witnessed. The father signaled to the others, and, unhurried, they lifted the coffin. They carried it toward the exit. This time, the church doors swung open without resistance, as though obeying their will. No one tried to stop them. We were too shocked, too terrified to move. As they disappeared into the night, the oppressive feeling in the air began to ease. One by one, people seemed to snap out of whatever trance they had fallen into. Some burst into tears. Others murmured questions that had no answers. The priest, visibly shaken, clutched his rosary, but could not find the words to comfort us. I don't remember how much time passed before I gathered the courage to leave the church. Outside, the late afternoon sky and crisp air felt unreal, like I was stepping from one world into another. Some townsfolk followed the strange family, at a distance, watching as they loaded the coffin into an old vehicle. They drove off toward Hubert's house, perhaps beyond. No one knew where they were going. No one dared to confront them. After that night, Fairhaven was never quite the same. Some who had witnessed the ritual became withdrawn, nervous. Rumors spread about the family, who they were, where they had come from, what they had done to Hubert's body. There were no records of them in nearby towns or counties. A few brave souls attempted to visit Hubert's house in the following weeks, but it remained locked and empty. Some swore they saw lights, flickering inside at odd hours. Others claimed they heard distant chanting. No one dared investigate further. As for me, I have no desire to uncover the truth behind that family's ritual. The memory of Hubert's body, sitting upright in his coffin, amid the swirling darkness and fevered chanting, is enough to haunt me in my nightmares. Sometimes, in my dreams, the father turns to me. He raises one hand, beckoning. His eyes burn like embers, inviting me to a place from which I know I could never return. I wake, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, certain that no lock on my door can keep out whatever was summoned in that church. The townspeople avoid speaking of that night. It's as if we formed an unspoken pact, a silent agreement that we had witnessed something beyond our understanding. We go on with our lives, pretending nothing happened, but there's a collective tension, a lingering presence in the air. And at dusk, when the wind carries whispers from the woods, I remember that chanting. I recall Hubert's lifeless form shifting on its own, and I know some doors once opened can never truly be closed. I witnessed something I will never be able to erase from my mind. It's not a ghost story, nor a made-up legend to scare people. It's something I personally experienced, an event that still haunts me on those nights when I close my eyes, and the silence becomes unbearable. This happened in Chicago in 2017, during the wake of a child who had died suddenly. His family was devastated, weeping in the corners of the funeral home. The place smelled faintly of withered flowers and something I couldn't identify at the time, but later associated with death itself. I worked at the funeral home. I had seen many things in my life, countless farewells, many faces contorted by grief. But that night was different. I remember the child's mother insisting that the coffin remain open. She did not want to stop, seeing her son as though she feared that by shutting it, her little one would vanish forever. We complied, even though it was unusual. Around midnight, the viewing room grew heavy with silence. The prayers were done, and visitors had slowly departed until only the closest family members remained, whispering stories about the child. They seemed to believe that speaking of him might bring him back, even if just for one more moment. And then it happened. One of the aunts, who was seated near the coffin, let out a piercing scream. We all turned, alarmed. She was pointing with a trembling hand into the coffin, and I saw it. I saw what should have been impossible. The child's hand was moving, slowly but visibly. First, the fingers, then the whole hand. Somebody else screamed. Chaos erupted. The mother fainted on the spot, and several people ran out of the room in a panic. I was paralyzed, staring fixedly, hoping for a logical explanation. Someone called the paramedics. The collective whispering turned into a roar of fear and confusion. Some claimed it was just a muscle reflex, while others swore the child had come back to life. But when the paramedics arrived and opened the coffin, the sight was even more horrifying. The body was still, just as stiff. The eyes remained closed, the skin lifeless, no breath, no pulse, nothing. Yet all of us had seen him move, every single one of us. When the child's mother regained consciousness, she refused to go near him again. She kept mumbling about a bad omen, saying that her son was not at peace, that something was taking him away. Some tried to calm her, but we all secretly felt the same. Something in that room was not right. It wasn't just fear, it was the sense of a presence in the darkness, something that was watching us. The worst part came when the family decided to leave without taking the body. They said they could not bear to bring him home, that they did not wish to see him anymore. They left abruptly, without looking back, as though running away was their only salvation. I had never seen a family abandon their own deceased. They left me there, alone, with the haunting image of that hand moving and the suffocating weight of silence that followed. Once I was alone in the funeral home, the air seemed thicker. The hallways felt longer, and I could almost hear the breath of something unseen. I glanced at the coffin one last time before heading out. I did not dare get too close. I had no desire to see if the hand might move again. To this day, recalling that moment gives me chills, and I wonder what truly happened. Deep down, though, I feel it might be better not to know. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I reached home, locked the door and turned off the lights, the image of that hand moving inside the coffin tormented me. I knew it wasn't just my imagination, because we all saw it. The aunt's scream, the mother's fainting, the family's flight, as if something worse than death had appeared during that wake. Yet what disturbed me most was that afterward, no one claimed the body. They didn't just leave, they abandoned him, as if they knew something we didn't. The following day I had no choice but to return to the funeral home. The child's body was still there, unclaimed. No one had called about burial arrangements. No relative wanted responsibility. It was unusual, though not unheard of. Sometimes families vanish in their grief, leaving us to handle the final steps. But something about this situation gnawed at me. If no one came within a certain time frame, protocol dictated that unclaimed bodies be sent to a common grave. But I felt this child couldn't remain in that coffin for long. Some inner alarm insisted he shouldn't stay within those walls. That afternoon, while I was in the office organizing paperwork, the temperature of the funeral home dropped abruptly. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked toward the viewing room, the sense that someone else was there intensifying. Cautiously, I made my way inside, lungs tight with anxiety. I opened the door slowly. Everything was in its place: wilted flowers, half-burnt candles, and the coffin was now closed. Yet no one had touched it since that night. I had personally left it open. The family had not returned, and after the cleaning staff tidied up, no one went back inside. But here it was, securely, shut as if nothing had happened. My heart. I approached, setting a hand on the cold wood. A dull thump came from inside. I recoiled instantly, nausea swirling in my gut. Something was inside that coffin. Something that had no business moving. I held my breath, waiting, but the only sound was my own blood drumming in my ears. I tried to dismiss it as fear, just a trick of the mind, but I knew what I felt, and I knew what I heard. I realized I couldn't face this alone. I phoned the owner of the funeral home and relayed only part of the story, about the family abandoning the body and that something odd was going on. I didn't dare mention what we had witnessed, that hand moving in the night. He told me to leave everything as it was and that he would personally address it soon, but I couldn't wait. I sensed we didn't have time. That night, I remained at the funeral home, not by choice, but because I felt something terrible might happen if I left. I stayed in the office with the lights on, trying to distract myself. But my mind kept returning to that same coffin, to the horrifying memory of the child's fingers moving. At around 3 a.m, the air grew denser, as if the entire building was straining to contain something. The walls themselves felt as though they were pressing inward. Then I heard it, a faint scraping noise like claws or nails dragging across wood from the inside. I jumped, my skin prickling with goosebumps. The sound grew louder, turning into dry thumping. Terrified, I wanted to flee, but I also felt compelled to figure out what was happening. So I found myself moving quietly toward the viewing room. With every step, my breath grew shallower. Each footfall echoed in my mind. When I reached the room I saw, the coffin had shifted a few inches. A chill shot down my spine. Then I heard it, a slow, harsh breathing, coming from inside the coffin. I stumbled backward, seized by a fear I had never felt before. A primal impulse told me to run. But deep down I sensed it wouldn't end just by my leaving. Abruptly a loud crash burst from within. The coffin lid rattled wildly, as if something inside was shoving upward, something that either should not have been alive or never truly was dead. I dashed out of the funeral home without a backward glance, leaving the doors open, not caring about anything except escape. To this day, I have no idea what happened to that child's body. But one thing is certain: whatever inhabited that coffin was no longer the same boy his mother had mourned. And worst of all, every night when I close my eyes, I still hear that dull thud, the sound of the coffin being struck. I only worked at a funeral home in Chicago for several years. It was a quiet, monotonous job, and though many people might find it creepy, to me, it was just another job. The somber atmosphere never really bothered me until that night. There was a particular room in the funeral home where we stored the coffins. It was a small space, smelling of wood and varnish, lit only by a flickering fluorescent lamp. Sometimes I would spend hours there, organizing inventory and making sure everything was in order. Over time, I got used to the creaking of the old wood and the strange echoes that formed in such a cramped space. One night I stayed later than usual because the owner asked me to count how many coffins were left in stock. While I was writing those numbers in an old notebook, I heard a dull sound, like someone knocking on the wood from inside. I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind sneaking through a gap somewhere. But then I heard it again. 3 slow, firm knocks. I stood there, frozen in place. The entire room was absolutely silent except for the buzzing of the lamp. I held my breath, hoping the noise wouldn't repeat. But it did. This time, the lid of one of the coffins slid open just a few inches, and I heard a faint whisper in the darkness, "Don't bury me yet." My lungs seized up and a chill ran through me. I got closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. With shaking hands, I lifted the coffin lid. It was empty. I jumped back immediately, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe the lid was badly fitted and fell on its own. Maybe the sound came from the building next door. I didn't want to stay there any longer, so I closed my notebook and left in a hurry, making sure I locked the door. That night I slept badly. I dreamed of those knocks over and over, and I woke up with the feeling that someone was whispering in my ear, even though I was alone in the room. I didn't tell anyone at the funeral home, for fear they'd think I was losing my mind. I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. But the knocking came back. The next night, as I did inventory, I heard it again, 3 precise knocks, followed by a sepulchral silence. I tried to ignore them, to force my mind onto my tasks, but when I turned, I saw another coffin with its lid slightly open, different from the one I'd seen the previous night. I approached it carefully, my stomach twisted in knots. When I put my hand on the lid, I felt a strong thud inside. I hadn't imagined it. I felt it in my bones. In a panic, I jumped back and ran out of that room, leaving everything behind. I didn't dare return until morning. The next day, I asked a co-worker if he had ever noticed anything strange in the coffin room. He just laughed and said the place always had a weird energy, but nobody liked to talk about it because it was better not to mess with things we didn't understand. That didn't exactly calm me. Over the following days, the knocking continued. It didn't matter if I was alone or with someone, whether it was daytime or nighttime. Sometimes the knocks were so soft you could barely hear them, like timid raps coming from inside a box. Other times they were aggressive, loud enough to echo throughout the whole space. I became obsessed, convinced that something or someone wanted to communicate from inside those coffins. One evening, armed with a flashlight and a determination fueled by terror, I stayed after closing. I locked myself in that room, switched off the lights, and waited. Time passed slowly. The silence was thick, as if the air itself was heavy with something invisible. Just as I was about to give up and leave, the knock rang out in the darkness. 3 in a row. I swallowed hard and went over to the coffin they seemed to be coming from. My hand trembled so badly that the flashlight beam swung wildly. I took a deep breath and laid my hand on the lid. Before I could open it, the lid moved by itself. I jumped back, colliding with another coffin. The flashlight fell and rolled across the floor. In the dim light, I watched as the lid lifted slowly, revealing the empty interior. But then, in the darkness of the coffin, something shifted, a twisting shadow, like it was too large to fit in such a tight space. It had no face, no body, but I felt it watching me, The air turned ice cold, and a soft whisper came from inside. "Don't bury me yet." I ran out of there and didn't look back. After that, I refused to enter that room alone. I had to be reassigned to another area, anything to avoid going back in there. I never told anyone exactly what I saw that night because I knew nobody would believe me. Over time, I learned that I wasn't the only one who had heard or seen strange things in that room. Some new employees claimed they had spotted shadows moving among the coffins. Others felt that someone was watching them whenever they were alone. But nobody ever spoke openly about it. It was better that way. Even today, years after leaving that job, I still dream of those knocks. Always 3, always followed by a crushing, suffocating silence. I wake up sweating, my skin crawling, certain that something is lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to open the lid again.